Hi friends, welcome to lectures by Professor Shilpa Khatri Babbar. Today's lecture is on women in India. We are primarily going to study the social problems which concern women in India and the legislations which have tried to pull women out of the situation of victimization to which they have been subjected since times immemorial. Now, one of the root cause of these kind of victimization or various forms of victimization has been patriarchy. And it is under the garb of patriarchy that the everyday life of women is throttling, it's limping forward and bleeding with the pain which has been inflicted over them for generations. To understand this concept of patriarchy, I shall take you down to the works of Sylvia Walby. Her text titled Theorizing Patriarchy, you can see it on the screen. In this, Sylvia has spoken about six patriarchal structures which restrict women and they maintain successfully, unfortunately, maintain male domination. However, she does recognize that women of different class and ethnic backgrounds and different sexual orientations, they experience these structures in different ways. Now, what are these six structures? If you will look at the screen, the first is paid work. Now, today, men continue to dominate the best paid jobs, and women are still paid less than men and do more part time work. Getting on to household production, we all know that individual men still benefit from women's unpaid labor. Getting on to culture, we know and we shall be discussing in the lecture that almost everything is as if ingrained in the culture. It's as if it has been sanctioned by the culture. Sexuality being the fourth structure of patriarchy. Now, despite the sexual liberation of 1960s, there is still a sexual double standard in the society. So, males condemn women who are sexually active as slags and those who are not as drags, which males with many sexual conquests are admired, sadly. When it comes to the fifth structure, which is that of violence, Walby sees violence against women as a form of male control of women. And finally, state. She feels that state is still patriarchal, it is racist and capitalist, and argues that there has been little attempt to improve women's position in the public sphere and equal opportunities legislation is rarely enforced. However, over the lecture, we shall look at the silver lining and how legislation, the courts, the judges have played a significant role as social engineers. Now, the World Economic Forum, if you can see on your slide, is primarily, a measure of the extent of gender-based gaps in four contexts. Number one, economic participation and opportunity. Number two, educational attainment. Number three, health and survival. And number four, political empowerment. So, in these four contexts, the World Economic Forum it measures the extent of the gender gaps, and it titles this measure as Global Gender Gap Index. And if you will see on the screen, what is available is the 2019-2020 Global Gender Gap Index, which, if you will see, has placed India on a rank of 112, and unfortunately we have actually fallen down by 4 steps as compared to the 2018 index which was put across last year. So now the point that we need to understand is that there are several manifestations of gender injustice, and it is not just located in what is popularly understood as domination, but gender injustice is located in oppression. And all oppression, please remember, is interconnected. So I am citing a text by Iris Young. And Iris, in her work Justice and the Politics of Difference, which was published in the year 1990, and here is attached a book review of this work. She states that oppression voices itself through five phases: exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and through violence. And this oppression, these five phases of oppression, they create an environment which obstruct and mute the communicative and learning abilities of women. There is a kind of a silent acceptance of the perpetual denier, and this perpetual denial and the silent acceptance, it becomes a part of their everyday life, which has been stereotypified as if this is how it has to be, and any deviation from this submission of women is quietened through the existing cultural arrangements popularly understood as or codified as culture. Now, throughout this particular lecture, which you are going to hear, each of these five forms of oppression have been viewed within the dynamics of the Indian socio-cultural arrangements vis-a-vis women. So, in simple terms, what is the aim of the lecture? The aim of the lecture, as I just shared with you, is primarily to put across the problematic nature of, the manifestations, the cultural manifestations, which are eroding the social structural arrangements with specific reference to women, and also the solutions to quite a few of those social problems in the form of legislations. So, now this particular lecture has been divided into two parts. Part one is what I'm sharing with you. I'll be highlighting certain case laws as illustrations. I would be discussing cases from a sociological angle. I shall also be discussing PWDVA with you as a legislation. Rest of the legislations I shall be not all, in fact, because the list is not exhaustive. So then other few significant legislations I'm going to discuss in part two of lecture carrying the same title. Now moving on to the first, that's exploitation as a form of oppression. Now, in the Vedic period, if I try to trace this element of oppression, or since when has it actually institutionalized itself, and when I talk about institutionalize itself, I mean since when has it become so everyday form of our existence that we have not even realized that it is something that's being superimposed upon a gender called women. And in the Vedic period, when I see women enjoyed a fair amount of freedom and equality. They studied in gurukuls, they participated in art, music, dance, and even warfare, and in fact performed religious duties alongside men. So this was, in a summary, in a one-line summary, it was a period of feminine glory, which was based on liberty, equality, and cooperation. As we move down in the later Vedic period, you will find that the status of women, as per the texts, the secondary data which is available, it suffered a setback with imposition of several restrictions on their rights and privileges. However, law did recognize their right to property, and I'm referring to Stridan. This was a significant right which was recognized in the later Vedic period despite the decline. So, somewhere or the other, at least that economic liberty, that economic space, that independence was still there. Now, the invasions in the medieval period was saw a massive deterioration in the position of women. The women were put behind veils, practices such as sati, child marriage, female infanticide, Devadasi system, they all started thriving. And all these were and similar such painfully discriminatory practices are sculpted in structural asymmetry and bulge on unlimited number of recorded and unrecorded occasions. Interestingly, if you will look at the last bullet, Young opines that injustices of exploitation cannot be done away with by mere redistribution of goods. So life is not just about material distribution of goods. It's about trying to locate the problems within the structural relations which have been stamped by social, cultural, legal, economic, and political arrangements between the two genders. Until the time we actually do not address these structural relationships, we will not be able to address the injustices of exploitation. Well, as we move down or move ahead in history, there has been a phase of ray of hope where, with the coming of the British rule, there was an awareness that was created. The 19th century social reform movement added to it. The 20th century nationalist movement. These all created awareness for the removal of social malaise. However, the constitution has been one such pillar which has stood in principle, which has stood in tune with the principles of equality, liberty, and social justice, and on several occasions, in fact, has amended itself to make it progressive in standing for women rights with women. In fact, in that particular context, have always said that Constitution of India should be seen as a flowing document and not something which has been penned down and that has been done forever. It has been a document or a set of mindsets which have been totally tuned towards social engineering. However, it is sad to share with all of you that there has constantly been a socio legal gap, and I will illustratively put this across. So, what you can see on the screen is basically a 1971. A report from the 1971 Committee on Status of Women. This is an excerpt from that particular report, which says that women are far from enjoying the rights and opportunities guaranteed to them. Social laws have remained unknown to a large mass of women. Now, audience, you need to understand that a similar observation on absolutely similar lines. This was made by the National Commission for Women in 2001. So you can see 1971, this was the situation, and 30 years later, in 2001, this situation continued to be as it was. Now, this socio-cultural lag is a very, very painful phenomenon. Uh, Exploitation of women through neglect has been working as an invisible termite. The gender dimension of malnutrition apparently explains the neglect and denial of affection. And I have shared with you a link, and whenever you get time, do go through this. It's a 2015 publication in Health Science Journal titled Child Malnutrition and Gender Preference in India, the Role of Culture. Now, this particular article has been authored by Vijayan Pillai and Rodrigues, and this article gives a beautiful insight into the gender dimension of malnourishment. Apart from the gender dimension of malnourishment, when we talk about exploitation of women through neglect, sex selective abortions is also very significant, and let me take you to that particular context. So for almost till the end of our lecture, we will actually locate ourselves around early 1970s, move towards late 70s, early 80s, and maybe later 80s. And I think that is what the time frame this particular lecture is going to carve out to you, contextually speaking, in terms of temporality. So around 1970s, when the Committee on Status of Women was formed, sex selective abortions was quite rampant. And this was the time when such prejudices, which till now were only bundled in the backyard of homes, was a hush hush story, was not to be shared with everybody because it was a family matter. They were now coming out in public, and the seemingly invincible and sacred institution called family was now being seen as the site of danger and exploitation. Now, this particular transformation is very contextual and historically located. So, I'm talking about India in 1970s, and you will see that India in 1970s was tied up with issues. There were a larger set of concerns centering on unemployment, price rise, collapse of existing livelihoods due to drought and famine, all of which merged with exploitation and suffering that women were subjected to. And so, if we try and locate, we will no more speak about very limited contexts when it comes to problems specific to women. Problems specific to women now were being addressed by women groups, and was being trying to locate into several manifestations: social, health, cultural, economic, and primarily economic, because the context which I shared with you was a context which was, a very economically, what do we say? It was economically very unstable and uncertain. And a lot of emphasis was being laid on larger concerns specific to women, such as employment for women, equal returns for their labor, proper conditions in which they were laboring, equality of opportunities, and so on and so forth. And below, I've given you a reference from where I have taken this particular slide. And In 1974, in the context which we have just discussed, the publication of Towards Equality, which was a report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, and was indeed described as a historical benchmark, it acted as a wake up call. Why? Because it showed that post independence, women had fared very poorly in four sectors: in terms of paid work, in terms of education, in terms of health, and in terms of political participation. In fact, the declining sex ratio and marginalization of women in informal sector made the situation worse. So let us now move towards trying to understand the concept of social engineering, given these social problems with specific reference to women. So I'm taking you through the case of Municipal Corporation of Delhi versus female workers on muster roll and others, and it proves that the struggle is continuous. Its manifestations change, but the problem continues to persist itself. In this particular case, the slant of exploitation was by denying maternity leave to female workers on muster roll who were engaged by the MCD on the ground that their services were not regularized. Let me also inform the audience that nothing contained in the Maternity Benefit Act of 1961 entitles only regular women employees to benefit of maternity leave, and not to those who are engaged on daily basis. But then it was brought to light in the said case that the provisions of the Act had not been applied to the MCD. So the Industrial Tribunal argued that the lacuna in the Act could be removed by the state governments by issuing the necessary notification under the proviso to Section 2 of the Act. The Supreme Court, in its efforts to eradicate the exploitation, interpreted the activities undertaken by the MCD, such as construction work, repair work, digging of trenches, and the like, and the word industry was redefined in this particular context. It was also decided that the dispute between the workmen, or for that matter, those employed on muster roll for carrying on these activities on the one hand, and the MCD on the other, would be tackled by an industrial dispute in the light of the various statutory provisions of the industrial law, one of which is the Maternity Benefit Act 1961. Now, in the context of prejudices manifested in unequal pay for equal works, in Srimati Bimla Rani and others versus Appellate Authority Equal Remuneration Act 1976, the High Court of Delhi intervened and held that India, being one of the signatories to the Convention concerning equal remuneration for men and women, the principle of equal remuneration for work of equal value may be applied through the legislative means. And I would appreciate if, in this particular context, which we are talking about in terms of how sex discrimination has been, being addressed through litigations, and how the judiciary has been trying to make its way through the patriarchal thickets, I suggest an article, and I have given the link here. It's a 2009 article which was published in EPW titled Judicial Meanderings in Patriarchal Thickets Litigating Sex Discrimination in India. It's been authored by Kalpana Kanabiran. And this is the context in which I was just sharing the Equal Remuneration Act 1976 with you. However, it becomes very significant as students of sociology or students of law, or for that matter, as citizens of India, for you to know that the Equal Remuneration Act 1976 has been now repealed, and it was repealed in August 2019 and replaced by the Code on Wages 2019. And ask me, I feel that the code is highly progressive in the given context, as it has moved away from the binary of men and women and acknowledges the need for equal pay for not just men and women, but in fact all genders, thereby extending the benefit of the law to other oppressed genders, including the transgenders. Uh, Getting back to the five phases of oppression on which we just discussed exploitation, the second is marginalization as a form of oppression. And again, historically locating ourselves in early 1970s, it was around 1970s that Self-Employed Women's Association, popularly known by their acronym SEVA, registered itself as a trade union. In fact, it actually moved out of that collective unionization of male and females, and they had empowered their own selves, not only to stand for their own selves but also for other women. So you can see that history is trying to get the manifestation of power back to the always portrayed silent, mute, passive victim. So Seva, they projected themselves as an organization of poor, self-employed women workers. And here is a link to this or their organization in whatever context you desire. You can actually go through. So, moving from early 70s to early 80s, the good news was that for the first time in the sixth five-year plan, there was a chapter titled Women and Development. Until then, women were actually perceived as mere recipients of welfare programs, existing at the margins of the society, as mute spectators. Their agencies as workers had not been factored into state development planning mechanisms, but were seen only as reproducers. Marginalization, in fact, dear friends, it wipes out the whole identity and existence of women from useful participation in social, economic, cultural, and political life, and thereby reducing women to, as you can see in the last bullet, to denial and to victims of denial and deprivation. Now, this is quite often justified through the restrictive patriarchal structures implicit in the personal laws, be that be the practice of instant divorce through triple talaq, which was outlawed in 2019, or the right to maintenance, or custody and spousal right, or the right to property, all have, in fact, deeply wounded, I must say, women. In fact, in 1980s, the nation faced a specter of community crimes and saw a rise of religious fundamentalism. Roop Convert's case, where she was drugged and was burnt alive and staged as public spectacle, was one such structured violence. And for a sociological understanding, you could actually go through this shared link. The institutionalized the persecution of women also comes flooding through cases such as Muhammad Ahmad Khan versus Shah Bano Begum and others, where domination and oppression they gush through forced patronization by men. So women were actually, and to a great extent, they continue to be used as custodians of community honor. But the wave of judicial activism created tides when the Supreme Court in Daniel Latifi versus Union of India read the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act in the touchstone of Articles 14 and 15 of the Indian Constitution, it was minutely observed that Section 31A of the Act states that a reasonable and fair provision and maintenance to be made and paid to her within the iddat period by her former husband. Now, the court, by way of its interpretative skills, held that the use of the word within the iddat period and not for makes it clear that this provision and maintenance extends not just for the iddat period but for the entire life of the divorced wife until she remarries. Another similar pledge to do away with marginalization and to restore the right to dignified living was in Geeta Hariharan versus RBI 1999. And I have shared a link which is actually a portion, carrying a portion of her own experience. And I'm going to actually read out an excerpt, a couple of lines, in fact, from that excerpt for each one of you. So, on discovering, so this is a collective which is speaking. On discovering that she was not the natural guardian of her then minor son, Geeta Hariharan decided to challenge the relevant sections of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956 and the Guardian and Wards Act 1980 that violate the equality promised by Articles 14 and 15 of Indian Constitution. It was noted that the father, by reason of a dominant personality, cannot be ascribed to have a preferential right over the mother in the matter of guardianship, since both fall within the same category. Few years later, Geeta says somewhere around 1989 is what she's trying to locate. I discovered I am still not considered the natural guardian of my child. I had applied to the Reserve Bank of India for its 9% relief bonds on behalf of my 11-year-old son. I was told that only the child's father could sign the application for either purchase or repayment. With the help of Women's Right Initiative Program for the Lawyers Collective, my husband and I filed a writ petition in the Supreme Court challenging the constitutional validity of Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956. 10 years after these recommendations in 1999, in a country that's clearing its throat for futuristic talk about the millennium, the law has acknowledged, albeit in cautious terms, that the mother too can be the guardian of the person and property of her child. Now, any discussion for that matter, which is with specific reference to inheritance and succession, would be incomplete without highlighting the socio-legal engineering to the Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005. The act cracked through the limitations imposed by structural inequalities and brought about equity between the male and the female inheritors. As a consequence, all daughters, including the married ones, were formally recognized as co-parceners in the joint family property and were given an equal share as given to the sons at the time of notional partition. Now, before I move ahead in this particular context, it becomes equally important for me as a teacher or as a learner who is probably in terms of age a little more experienced, that we need to also understand that if there are certain rights under the Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act 2007, all children, regardless of their gender, are equally responsible for the welfare of their aging parents. In fact, in 2016, Bombay High Court judgment emphasized that married daughters are equally responsible for their aging parents, thus speaking about equity not just in terms of rights but also in terms of duties. Interestingly, The marginalization has been apparent in armed forces also, and what you are going to see here, what you're seeing is a beautiful picture. You need to look at the expressions every time I see. Indeed, the title is absolutely true. Battle won, now win the war. Now, the battle is was put across through this particular case, the Secretary, Ministry of Defense versus Babita Punia and others. Now, to understand this particular case, let me take you down to the history here and make you understand what it was all about. Women were first inducted in 1927 in army only under the military nursing service. So, as students of sociology, you need to understand that women in terms of care. So, the only dimension where you could actually understand that women could manifest themselves and perform a role is in terms of care, right? So she was inducted only under the military nursing service. And in 1943, it was extended to the position of medical officers. In 1992, they were made eligible for appointment into specific cadres like Judge Advocate General and Army Educational Corps. Now, through this, they were initially brought in for 5 years of service, which was then converted into short service scheme with a tenure of 14 years. In 2008, permanent commission was extended to women in streams of JAG and Army Educational Corps. In 2019, only those women officers who had served less than 14 years were given permanent commissions by the government, citing physical limitations of older women officers. And what I find the most painful, and I'm sure we all would be in the same boat, is the fact that the government had also argued against appointing women in commanding roles, calling solidarity with the rural conventional social structure from where majority of the rank and file is being made, which is predominantly male and patriarchal. The masculine mentality's defiance to feminine leadership was put across. But the court rejected the irrational argument, and the 2020 Supreme Court judgment ruled that all women officers are now eligible for permanent commissions, allowing them to be in commanding roles. Now, this particular struggle against marginalization has been quite long drawn and is apparent in cases such as CB Muthuma versus Union of India, Muthama versus Union of India 1979, Air India versus Nargesh Mirza 1981, Taru Khurana versus Union of India 2014, to mention a few of them, all of which were contesting on the solid framework of Articles 14, 15, and 16. 14 talking about right to equality, 15 denying any form or not permitting any form of discrimination, 16 speaking about equality of opportunities for all relating to employment. It's very essential to ensure that social structures and legal structures they march together. For otherwise, this gender equity would be absolutely arbitrary, artificial, and evasive. As Young has mentioned, I've taken out that particular portion where she says it's not about redistribution of wealth. It's about addressing the structural relationships. So, with this, we actually move on to the next phase of oppression. And the next phase of oppression is powerlessness. And on your screen, one of my favorite actresses and director. So, Ankur is a beautiful movie which speaks upon the intersections of gender, caste, and class. And now, exploitation and marginalization, if you need to understand, they are actually used as tools through which primarily and manifestly, latently it's done everywhere, but manifestly in rural India, the right to dignity and even life is denied to powerless on grounds such as caste and class. The dominant castes or classes, they indulge in forced paternalization as if they have an institutionalized access to the body of the oppressed. So you'll see a lot of Dalit operation, Dalit women being raped, their kacha homes being burnt, only because there might have been some element of denial of these forced elements of paternalization. Well, powerlessness also gets is also apparent in cases such as Ashok Kumar Todi versus Kishwar Jahan 2011, or Lata Singh versus State of UP 2006. However, the court has played a very important role, rectified the social denial to choose one's life partner, even if outside one's caste, under Article 19, which is right to freedom. Powerlessness also gets manifested in areas of conflict such as Northeast India and Kashmir, where members, especially women, they end up living a dual identity. How is that dual identity manifesting itself? As an identity, as a woman, and an identity as a member of embattled minority group where where actually the communities where they are living, they internalize and they become punitive towards their own weaker members who are labeled as insignificant others, reducing them to the status of powerless victim. And one such case and a beautiful shape which this unfortunate happening has actually been kind of pulled to by the Supreme Court of India. Let's discuss this. So, in Chairman Railway Board and others versus Mrs. Chandrima Das and others, Supreme Court's intervention has visualized coercive imposition of power on a female in the form of rape, not merely as a crime against an individual woman, but rather as a crime against the entire society. So the society has always acted as an agency, superimposing the notion of powerlessness on women by denying her not just the right to choose her partner or to live with dignity, but also takes away from her takes away from her the right to choose her profession or expression, as partially discussed earlier also under marginalization and exploitation. However, courts have acted as social engineers. So, in Anuj Garg versus Hotel Association of India 2008, Section 30 of the Punjab Excise Act was questioned, which prohibited the employment of women in hotels and bars serving liquor. In Indian Hotels and Restaurants Association versus State of Maharashtra 2013, there was a prohibition of any type of dance performance in beer bars or eating houses under the Bombay Police Act, and this was not applicable to 3 to 5 star hotels. So the prohibition of the dance performance was there in beer bars or eating houses other than 3 to 5 star hotels under this particular act, Bombay Police Act. And this was challenged as being violative of Article 19. Now, extending from the notion of powerlessness is the fourth phase of oppression, cultural imperialism. It involves the universalization of a dominant group's experience and culture and its establishment as the norm. Such dominant views, values, and cultural products, they gain a greater currency because their experience is projected as an experience representative of as if the entire humanity. Unlike the oppressed group's interpretation of social life, which finds very negligible, very little space for expression, the dominant culture imposes its experience and view upon the dominated as if it's been a matter of their right. In fact, this is apparent from Suchita Srivastava and others versus Chandigarh Administration 2010, where the power exercised by the accused as well as the High Court over the female body has been condemned by the Supreme Court. This case is about the violent oppression exercised over a mentally retarded orphan in the form of rape, which took place while she was an inmate at a government run welfare institution. The victim, on knowing about her pregnancy, wanted to continue with it. In support, the Supreme Court extensively defined women's right to make reproductive choices as a dimension of her personal liberty. Under Article 21, personal liberty and dignity, I'm sure you all are aware, constitutes of the rights to livelihood, privacy, education, and also reproductive choices. And while defining reproductive choices, the Supreme Court included women's right to refuse participation in sexual activity as one, insistence on using contraceptive measures as the other, and freedom to use birth control measures as the third part of her reproductive choices as a part of her right. Now, violence as a form of oppression has in fact had a a sagacity which has been very deeply set in. So, talking about reproductive choices, whether it be about ascertaining wife's virginity, like in the case of Zahida Begum versus Mushtaq Ahmed 2006, or Sujit Singh versus Kanwarji 2003, or about determining the paternity of the child and questioning the character of mother in case of Gautam Kundu versus State of West Bengal 1993, or the case of Neera Mathur versus LIC 1992, where the LIC questionnaire sought information about the past pregnancies and other intimate details to avail of its policies, all of which have treated women as objects. The judges and courts have treated them as significant subjects having human rights and dignified existence. So, under the various manifestations of violence, you will find that there is this defenselessness and vulnerability of females, which has been collectively responsible for repeated acts of violence against women. And over a period of time, this deep seated sagacity of male preeminence has as if become institutional, systemic. It has actually amounted to a social practice. And the so called intellectuals, I mean, when we talk about jurisprudence, we talk about names like Aristotle, Bacon. Aristotle's view that male is more ensued to rule than female, or Bacon's proposition that the husband hath by law the power and dominion over the wife and may mildly beat her, all this reveal upon domination as a form of gender injustice. In fact, the ancient law given by Manu and Yajnavalkya entrusted the responsibility of protecting females upon either father or husband or son, given the various stages of life. This was seen as a justification behind mild disciplines in the interest of women and family. Please remember, violence against women occurs both within the home and outside the domestic walls. This form of oppression can be as silent as an unwelcome symbolic comment, maybe a wink of an eye, maybe a stare, maybe a blank look, or as loud as a physical molestation. And coming back to 1970s, a large number of women's organizations, as I've shared with you, they came together. They came together to fight for their own community, to fight for their community, and this war against their community, this battle against their community, was primarily located in two contexts, because that was the time when rape and dowry deaths were actually disturbing both the private spaces as well as the public spaces. And in this particular context, I would like to draw your attention to three important cases which brought rape and the exploitative vulnerability to the national levels. One is that of Ramiza B., The other is that of Maya Tyagi, and the third one is that of Mathura. The link I have attached here for Ramiza B, which is the 1978 horrific gang rape by policemen and violent death of her husband in Hyderabad. And in this particular context, I would like to share with you there is a novel penned down by Meena Alexander. The novel is titled Nampali Road, in which Meena is drawing eerie similarities between the 1978 incident of Ramiza B and the 2013 Delhi gang rape, where both the victims were coming back from movie and their character assassination took place, and then they were brutally raped. And it is indeed very disturbing. However, the only reason why I want you to have a look at this is that the structures have not changed. So when the report came out in 1971 and 2001, the situation was the same. In 1978, when Ramiza B was raped, and in 2013, when Nirbhaya's case came in, the situations have not changed. And in fact, in part two, we'll see that the Criminal Law Amendment Act started amending itself from 1983, 2013, and then 2018. So, from Mathura's case to Nirbhaya to the Kathua, the painful episodes are continuing. The case other than Ramiza B is Maya Tyagi, and I have shared a link with you, and I'm sharing an excerpt from that particular link for all of you, and we could actually read it together. Maya Tyagi was traveling in a car with her husband and two of his friends through Bulandshahr district of UP when their car broke down near Bhagpat police station. When the men left to get the tire repaired, a policeman in plain clothes molested Maya. When Ishwar, that's her husband, saw this, he slapped the policeman, who later returned with 10 other policemen and shot dead all three men accompanying Maya Tyagi. She was then dragged out of the car, stripped naked, and paraded through the marketplace. When she resisted, she was further attacked by inserting lathi into her. Later at Bhagpat police station, she was tortured more and arrested on false charges of being the dacoit's mistress, a cover up for the killing for obvious reasons. Now, this case led to a national outrage. The police had the audacity of justifying their actions at the judicial inquiry on the grounds that Maya was sexually promiscuous. In a sense, the police argued that it was legitimate to rape a woman who is of easy virtue. The commission concluded, and the conclusion is not a sigh of relief, because the commission concluded that Maya Tyagi's husband and his friends were not dacoits, good, but were falsely framed by the police to cover up the killings, good. The commission also found that all the accounts of torture and violence by the police on Maya Tyagi were true, thankfully, good, though unfortunate. However, and this is where I get pained, since there was no penile penetration of the vagina, the commission found that the violence did not constitute rape. So, being a woman, it becomes very painful to understand and locate this kind of you know indifference, painful indifference, violation of dignity of women. Anyway, apart from Ramiza B, as history moved to Maya Tyagi, it also moved to Mathura. And I have shared a link here, a title of which states the girl whose rape changed the country. And this girl is Mathura, a tribal girl from Maharashtra who had eloped with her boyfriend. And when this was reported to the police by her father and brother, she was raped by uniformed policemen in the toilet behind the police station with her family waiting outside. Can you see the violation of space? Can you see the violation of relationships? The rape case was heard and the High Court convicted the police, but the Supreme Court acquitted them. labeling Mathura as a willing party for absence of any visible marks of injuries, which were read as no resistance being offered and therefore willingness was presumed. It went to the extent of stating that she was used to sex and might have incited a policeman to have intercourse with her. It is very painful to share this kind of information with all of you. However, as sociologists, we need to experience it, at least the context when we put across that how unfortunate it would have been for the victim then, and how significant it is for each one of us who is listening to this particular lecture to empower yourself right now. Please remember, it was because of such kind of a sociological imagination and empowerment that 8 years later, women's group came together and asked for another trial in Mathura's case. And with God's grace, it was in 1983, at least in 1983, when the Criminal Law Amendment Act was passed, that the onus of proof was shifted away from the victim to the accused, and several other significant concerns were raised, such as custodial rape was defined, in camera trials started taking place, and we shall all do in when we do Criminal Law Amendment Act in our lecture part 2. So as shared earlier with each one of you, that the 1970s was the time when women had empowered themselves to fight for their own rights, and they were fighting in two contexts. One was rape and the other was dowry. Now, dowry death also became a matter of grave concern around 1970s, and a typical pattern was apparent in such cases. So the newspaper read accidental death due to bursting of the stove, and such like cases were immediately closed as suicides. Women groups, they acted as mediators and they objected to this, and they insisted on recording dying statement of victims and stopped remarriage of guilty men. And in fact, appealing the societal consciousness and taking the domestic outside the realm of family, politicizing the personal was made possible by plays like Om Swaha by activist Shiba Chachi. And this play depicted the 1978 dowry death of Hardeep Kaur. This is a link which will speak a little more about Chachi's work, about the theatre group which had put across Om Swaha. And to read a little more about Hardeep Kaur, this is the link which I'm sharing with you on the screen, and I'm reading an excerpt from this particular from this particular link. In Delhi of late 1970s, dowry deaths were so commonplace that newspapers relegated them to city briefs. But Hardeep Kaur's murder in October 1978 in Jangpura, a middle class colony, was so brazen that it refused to be shrunk into three lines in a single column. Her death screams were heard by a neighbor as she burnt in the sitting room of her home. Kaur's story became the core of one of India's first feminist street plays, Om Swaha, which I have just discussed with you, and it ended in a landmark anti-dowry legislation in 1980s. Now, with the state depicting the real and mounting pressures from women's groups, the state was compelled to investigate all suspicious deaths which took place within 7 years of marriage. This concerted mobilization led to the expansion of the definition of the term cruelty to include physical and mental harassment both as non bailable offenses. In this process, family was revisited as a site of violence, bias, and discrimination. In this context, several important legislations were institutionalized, and one such legislation which we shall address in this part of the lecture is Protection of Women Against Domestic Violence Act. popularly again known by its acronyms PWDVA 2005. The other legislations like Sexual Harassment at Workplace Prevention, Protection and Redressal Act 2013, or for that matter, Criminal Law Amendment Act. I shall be doing that in part 2 of this particular lecture. Moving on to PWDVA 2005, I find it as one of the most progressive legislatures for reasons mentioned below. Now, while India had, in fact, criminalized domestic violence way back in 1983 and defined it as mental and physical cruelty, but primarily the focus continued to remain on physical violence, and that too within the ambit of dowry related issues. PWDVA broadened the definition of domestic violence. So now domestic violence included all types of family relationships, be they be consanguineal or affinal, or adoptive or live-ins. So by such a definition, it brought into its ambit domestic violence against men and between women and extended to women and men in live-in relationships. Further, domestic violence encompassed actual abuse or the threat of abuse that's physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and economic. And at least the inclusion of sexual violence has given some recognition and brought some relief to victims of marital rape. It moved beyond, the PWDVA moved beyond criminalization and included within its ambit civil protection of women. In other words, the act provided for women's right to reside because very often the man used to be drunk, used to hit this woman and tell her to get out of my house. Now, this particular act provided her the right to reside in the matrimonial or shared household, whether or not she has any title or right in the household. This right is secured by a residence order, which is passed by the court. PWDVA also initiated the position of a protection officer who would assist the victim in seeking legal assistance or maybe legal aid, medical examination, safe shelter, and so on. The Act provides for breach of protection order or interim protection order by the respondent as a cognizable and non-bailable offence. In fact, in part 2 of my lecture, I shall be dealing with PWDVA also in greater detail. So here the focus was more on cases and there the focus is going to be more on legislations. Here the cases was more on social problems and the cases deriving out of those problems. Now, coming to the conclusion of our lecture for today, please let us think aloud. These social problems that we have been discussing related to women, these are not today's pain. These are not yesterday's pain. These are neither sporadic nor are episodic, but rather they are something which is continuous. It is something which is cumulative. It is taking place in almost every space, public and private, and I'm sorry to intervene, but please try and locate it is happening in your households also. At least emotional violence is something that I face and see, speak to my friends, and I see that happening face to face, both at private sectors as well as in public spaces. So, the most painful fact is that we have stopped realizing it. Why? Because we have internalized it. We have internalized it as if it has become a way of our everyday form of experience. And so we say, this is how it is. So we try to naturalize it. At the end, I leave you all with a question. I leave you all with a food for thought. Now, did you ever realize the problematic nature of labor in post-modernity or contemporary times? What is happening with this collusion of capital and joint exploitation? What is this? The global firms, they are increasingly coming to share the labor pools used by service industries. And these are dependent on cheap labors. Where is this cheap labor coming from? This is an overall rise in demand. This is justifying the overall rise in demand for female labor. For poor countries, are linked to increasing demands in richer countries for consumer goods and services. So all those FTZs, the free trade zones, The jobs which they have generated, there has been an out-migration of rural women throughout Asia, and at the same time, low wages and vulnerability to layoffs have driven many to moonlight as prostitutes in China, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Sri Lanka. In fact, Filipino women have been imported as maids into Hong Kong and South Asian countries, where local young women have flocked into factories. Female migrants from Thailand and Sri Lanka have also sought employment as maids and sex workers in Gulf, Japan, and West Germany. As production capital roams the world seeking more flexible conditions of maximization and its labor becoming intertwined with those of transnational service industries, there is a blurring which is taking place. Blurring of the traditional boundaries between different occupational, sectorial, and national groups. And my dear friends, this blurring has also been blurring the not just the production possibilities but also exploitation, oppression, and marginalization of women. So what can we do given the lockdown period? What can we do? How do we voice ourselves? We voice ourselves by knowing more about groups like Raise Your Vibration. Now, this Raise Your Vibration, which is on your screen, is a global movement to end violence against all women and girls, cisgender, transgender, and those who hold fluid identities that are subject to gender based violence. The rise of misogynist authoritarian regimes the world over, from United States to Philippines, from India to Brazil, has recalibrated their work, further escalating the urgency with which we feel compelled to fight for gender, climate, economic, and racial justice. And please, we all can do it. Sitting here, I created a channel for all of you. I created a blog which titled We Can Make a Difference. But this difference should not be seen at an individual level, my dear friends. It needs to be seen at a level which is collective, where each one of us need to actually stand up and start voicing ourselves. We actually need to understand how painful the situation is, and we need to stop this pain. So, thank you so much for being with me for this particular lecture. Continue subscribing for my YouTube channel, and I shall continue creating contexts and situations for all of you, and we shall indeed fight this battle together. God bless, stay safe, keep yourself in good mental health. Take care.